today, what is the criteria for something, uh, labeling a crime as a genocide, as opposed to just a massacre or mass killing or some other kind of atrocity?
Yes, it's even contested today what the rules are. There are judicial decisions and scholarly and UN commentaries, some of which take a very broad approach to what a genocide is or could be, and some of which take a very narrow approach. Some people would like to say, for example, in the World Court or the International Court, in the International Criminal Court, that if you do not kill the entire surviving population and you let them flee, that's ethnic cleansing and not a genocide. It could be an extermination, it could be a murder, it could be a war crime, it could be a variety of things. That's not a genocide because you lack the intent, the specific intent to destroy. And they read the term destroy to mean destroy completely, even though textually, number one, the Genocide Convention says in whole or in part. That's textually. Then contextually, when they were framing the crime, they cited all these examples that were in part. The number one example that it was framed around was the Holocaust. And the Holocaust in every single country was in part. It ranged from, 90% of the Jewish population to less than 10% was killed. It depended upon local conditions, collaboration, amount of number of camps, scenarios of conflict and scarcity and so forth in the area. But it was varied greatly. Uh, and then that's not to mention all the other examples people cited. So Raphael Lemkin, who came up with the idea of genocide, said we should have a crime that's not primarily about the individual, but it's about the culture of the individual. You're attacking their culture or their nation or their religion. So it should be about losing the distinctive cultural contributions and geniuses that come from having different types of peoples in the world. So he cited a number of examples to the UN drafting committee and to other governments and so forth, on the media and wrote articles and all this kind of thing. He cites the Armenians from World War One as a prime example besides the Holocaust. It's probably the most common one he cites besides the Holocaust is Armenians. Then he cites the Assyrians in 1933 in Iraq, the Simele massacre, on several occasions. Then he talks about things like German colonies and ancient Rome, the Christians of ancient Rome, of course, who were not completely exterminated, or there'd be no Christians today if they had squelched it in the bud. I suppose there'd be no Western Christians. There still could have been Eastern Christians. And he also cites things like the Crusades, medieval wars and the siege of Magdeburg, sort of Protestant versus Catholic warfare and massacre. So all of his examples are in part. And there are many examples of groups not even all being deported at the same time. And even if they were all deported, not everybody was killed. So that's why I criticize this narrow interpretation that you sometimes see.
So on your understanding, it's not necessarily about the numerical number of people that are killed and the proportion of a certain ethnic, religious, national, or racial group that are killed. It's about the intent to try to target those specific groups because they belong to that specific group. Is that more or
Well,
less
the
correct?
number does go to the intent because if the number is very low as a percentage of the group, and if there are other reasons why you could be doing this, it tends to rebut the idea that you are targeting the group for its groupness. So, for example, the United States, D-Day, and the invasion of Italy in World War II, they start dropping bombs on Normandy, southern France, eastern France, Sicily, southern Italy, Naples, all these places, because there are Germans there and Italian troops, and they're ejecting them. But they kill like tens of thousands of French and Italian civilians, maybe 100, let's say 100,000 in both cases. It's still not a genocide of the French or Italians by the United States, because they are engaging in combat with these other forces who are large, who are who have conquered this area, and they're ejecting them. And these other people are being hit incidentally. They're not being rounded up and have their heads cut off, by and large, maybe sometimes, or they're not being rounded up and physically abused and starved in a small camp or something, or their children are not being taken by the U.S. soldiers as their own children. These are some of the things that the Genocide Convention uses to distinguish war from genocide: deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group or in whole or in part, transferring children from the victim group to the perpetrator group, inflicting serious bodily or mental harm on the group with the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. These are different from, I'm bombing your city because I'm at war with you and you're defending it.
So in the Assyrian case, we don't necessarily need admission from Ottoman officials or the Ottoman government that they are intending to completely destroy or in part destroy the Assyrian populations, because if their actions indicate that they had intent on doing this and the results of their actions indicate this, so you're saying that we can then infer from those actions that they had a genocidal intent against the Assyrians?
Yes, and though it is very helpful to have admissions, and there are a variety of admissions that I look at and other people look at, things that were said to the American ambassador, things that were said in memoirs after the war. Hakan Dadrian went through all that stuff because he read Turkish, and collected things there. Things that the Germans said that somebody told them. These were allies, and sometimes these were confidential German cables, so why would they lie to their own government about something negative that their own ally had told them? So these are very helpful, but it's not necessary. And there are two examples I often look at as to why it's not necessary. Bosnia, Srebrenica, and Kosovo. So Yugoslavia, the government of Yugoslavia would say, we have nothing in the abstract against the Bosnian Muslims or the Kosovar Muslims. We've lived with them in peace since World War II. Their population has increased. We've electrified their areas and given them education and food and jobs and all these other things. But now they're rebelling in league with our historic colonizer, Turkey. So we have to go to war with these rebellious villages and cities and bombard them with artillery and, take up trench positions like in Ukraine and fight until we can reach a peace deal, which they said they were trying to do. Well, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and other people say, no, you have a genocidal intent because we see that in Srebrenica, hundreds of men have disappeared after you took over the city of Srebrenica, and we're inferring from that action, rounding people up and killing them, that you want to exterminate the Bosnian Muslim group. Plus, you've said publicly you're seeking revenge against the Bosnians, you're seeking revenge against the Kosovar terrorists and so forth. So we see that 44 people have been killed in the village of Ratsak in Kosovo. So NATO declares a genocide. Germany, United States, England declare a genocide and go to war against Yugoslavia over Kosovo, even though the government of Yugoslavia had been sitting down with the Kosovar side and having peace talks. And before the rebellion had started, had, built them up, you could argue, statistically. It wasn't a complete defense that number one, that they made these protestations that, no, we have a good reason and a legitimate purpose and so forth. And number two, it wasn't a complete defense that there were so many survivors. And there were so many survivors in Bosnia and Kosovo that the victim group became the government of the area where the genocide supposedly occurred. Whereas today, you know, if the Assyrians and the Armenians governed Eastern Anatolia, who would talk about the Armenian and Assyrian genocide? Nobody. If they had their own states there, nobody would talk about it. But they talk about it, even though there is a Bosnian state and a Kosovar like statelet. Some people recognize it, some people don't, but it exists. And so I look at some of this jurisprudence to say the mere fact that there was a rebellion and that you do not admit it is not the final factor.
So you mentioned that there actually were some examples of the Ottoman officials admitting intent to commit genocidal actions. And I was just wondering if you could give one or two examples of that proof of the admission or intent to commit those genocidal actions against the Assyrians at the time.
Yeah, so the military commander Rashid Bey said he exterminated the Assyrians of Persian Azerbaijan. One of the ruling triumvirate, Jamal Pasha, said that the Christians had to be targeted, or they suffered what they did because they had taken the wrong side, basically. And he basically admitted to like overdoing it or a broad approach, you could say, in his memoirs. There are things that were said by the special organization, the Ottoman sort of like, you could call it like a CIA or a like a covert unit that would work with criminals and local tribes people to do like non-conventional operations, not the conventional army, but the special operations. And there is a variety of like euphemisms for extermination in their records. The deportation documents. I think Taner Achem wrote a book called what was it called? The Armenian Genocide Cables, or something like that. The telegrams, the Armenian Genocide telegrams, something like that. Where there's been a longstanding debate about do the telegrams from Central Ottoman Command, Istanbul or the war front, to the regional military commanders and sort of civilian security officers and governors, do these reflect that the Armenians are going to be resettled from the conflict zone in an orderly manner and provided with food and housing, or that they're basically going to be rounded up and pushed into the interior where local tribes will have their way with them and they will be almost naked and certainly undefended. And then we will distribute their homes and businesses among Turks and refugees from the Balkan Wars and Circassia. There's a few telegrams that say that, there might be some food coming, or we're going to build a barracks in Syria for people who've been deported from Armenian towns in Anatolia. But there's also a variety of telegrams that indicate that there are massacres going on. People are arriving without the menfolk. The women are being abused. The children are being distributed. People cannot return to their villages. They're enemies of the state, and all this kind of thing, which you would also read like in a Nazi telegram or in a Rwandan genocide sort of document. There are conflicting documents in the Rwandan genocide too. I mean, there are some interesting articles if you look up the scholarship of the defense lawyers for the Rwandan genocide suspects, where they try to defend their client and say that there are documents indicating their innocence as well as their guilt. There might be some incriminating documents, there might be some exculpatory documents, and this is almost always the case. Even in Nuremberg, a variety of defendants said there are documents that indicate I was not all bad. Even Eichmann said there are some documents that exonerate me, this or that. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying that's what lawyers and the accused sometimes say. And sometimes they can find a paragraph here or there that supports their position. So yeah, I believe there are these admissions in the documented record. Vakan Dadrin did a lot of them. Tanner Acham did a lot of them. I found some others, but a lot of the ground was covered by them before I even really got on the scene. So I have to credit them.
I mean, I'm assuming that modern day Turkey or Turkey in any period has not publicly or officially acknowledged this genocide. What are some of the arguments that the Turkish government or people who deny this as a genocide? What are some of the arguments that they
Yeah,
make?
interestingly, the government has actually admitted it probably several times, I would argue. Number one, the Treaty of Sèvres led to basically an armistice and so forth. It's kind of like a Treaty of Versailles for the eastern part of the war. And part of it said that there were massacres during the war of non-Christian subjects. And it describes several of the acts that the other documents and admissions describe as happening to the non-Christian subjects. First of all, massacres, but some other things too. Loss of lands. So the Sultan signs that. That's what it's like, Truman's representative and the Emperor's representative signing the thing on the ship to end World War II with Japan. Like someone has to sign this thing. It's the government representative. And they can't do it on their own just because they're a clerk of the army or whatever. That's number one. Number two, the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, said one time that the old governments had done like fascistic ethnic cleansing or something like this, or there had been fascistic acts by past governments. And I guess he was trying to do it to like contrast, like now we have a justice and development party, I think is what his party is called. But before there was like unjust fascistic leadership, the Kemalists, and before that the Ottoman Sultan. We're like way beyond them. But it's for the state, it's an admission. Then there's a variety of other things where they put documents on their website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, oh, yes, there were massacres of Armenians, but it was during a chaotic situation and there were survivors. So they think they're defending themselves by saying, well, there were survivors and there was not a complete eradication, but it's actually highly incriminating because, like I said before, complete extermination is not required. I don't know if I answered your whole question.
No, you did. The other part of it, which, I mean, the question was based on the premise that the Ottomans have denied it and made a case why it wasn't a genocide. And then the second part of that question was, what are the arguments for it not being called a genocide? And it sounds like some of them are that it was during war and that there were survivors, as you just said.
Yeah, no, and the third one would be there were also Turkish and Kurdish civilians who were killed, including killed by Armenians and Assyrians. So those are probably the top three, but some others might be like numerical arguments, like the number of Armenians and Assyrians was not that high in the first place. Number two, the number of survivors was actually very high. So they would say that there were originally only 1.1 or 1.2 million Armenians who had not voluntarily migrated to Russia already in 1914. And then there were 800,000 at the end of the war. So the deduction is 300,000 to 400,000, not 1 million or 1.2 million or 1.5 million, all of which you see Armenian genocide scholars quoting. The actual original records, some of the German records, they talk about 1.5 million as of 1918 to 1920, just Armenians. But there's various numerical arguments you can make to minimize the original population and maximize the residual population to say that it was not a majority that was killed, or it was a relocation, or whatever. So as to the first point, as I said before, all these genocides that Lemkin listed and that tribunals have discovered have occurred during some kind of a war: World War II, Rwandan Civil War, Yugoslav Civil War, Cambodian international wars, Myanmar civil war. There's a few that don't involve a war. The UN once spoke about the Iranian extermination of the Baha'i faith or Baha'i leaders, but there was the Iran-Iraq war at that time, and people talk about Chinese Uyghurs sometimes, like the United States. Is that a civil war? Probably not. So there's a war in most of these cases that have resulted in a conviction or a theory as to why it's a genocide. Number two, the survivors. I think I already addressed that. Number three, the Turkish and Kurdish victims. And here I note that the Germans actually have a much better argument, and the Hutus have a much better argument for victims on their side than the Turks or the Kurds in World War One. Because, of course, Germany lost like millions of people, and the cities were turned utter rubble, including the capital city, which didn't happen to Istanbul or Smyrna, the nice city on the coast, or Ankara, or several other cities. They still have their ancient, churches and mosques and everything, whereas a lot of the stuff in Germany and Japan was totally destroyed. So that's not a good defense that you had civilian victims on your side. Also, they were invading 3 continents: Asia, Europe, and Africa. Or in the period that they include as suffering all these casualties, like from 1820 to 1924, they had operations on all 3 continents. So that's a huge place in which to say, oh, we lost all these soldiers. Well, of course, you're trying to fight 100 different peoples. It doesn't mean you didn't perpetrate genocide. And the Germans, similarly, they lost men against the French resistance, against the Dutch resistance in Russia, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, in Poland, against the Americans, bomb from the air, blockade, poison gas in World War One. It's not a defense. No one's ever considered that to be defense, that you've had all these. Now, it can be a defense sometimes when there's mutual combat and both sides are suffering civilian casualties in the context of, let's say, Russia and Ukraine. They both fire missiles at each other's cities. The proportions and the modalities are relevant to whether there's a genocide or not. And maybe if Ukraine suffers a huge number of civilian casualties, they could use that as an excuse for why any civilian casualties they cause in Russia are not a genocide but a self-defense. It's relevant, but it's not the defense that they often think that it is. Of course, the Serbs in the Yugoslav wars suffered a large number of civilian casualties on their side. The Hutus, no one ever mentions this, but Hutus, according to UN records, they were suffering tens of thousands of civilian deaths every month. And the Hutus are also, they go beyond Rwanda. If you include the Hutus in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's possible that more Hutus have died in this whole 30 years of conflict, since the 80s or the early 90s than Tutsis. Which you can't say about Turks and Kurds versus Armenians and Assyrians, most likely, if you believe the 1.5 million Armenian thing. It's definitely not true. And if you include Greeks, it's probably not true either. And if you look at the statistics, which I often do, for Turkey after the war, the Christians were 4%, to 8% before the World War I period. Then they were less than 1%. And there were 12 million Turks and Kurds remaining. And today, sometimes Kurds say that there are 15 to 20 million Kurds just in Turkey. So how could there have been this massive targeting of Kurds if you have all these Kurds surviving, and not just surviving, but growing to where, there are only less than 100,000 Armenians and 10 million Kurds. And the Armenians and the Kurds used to be a similar number in the late Ottoman Empire. So there's a vast disparity today, which is more like what you would see with the German Jews or the Polish Jews or something like that than what you would see with 2-state wars, where it's kind of balanced.
What is? I mean, we talked about the cases for it being called a genocide, and you kind of debunked some of the defenses for it not being called a genocide. I'm just wondering why in your opinion is it important for this to be called a genocide versus just a massacre? Like, what are the implications and the benefits, I guess, of labeling it as a genocide, or it being classified as a genocide as opposed to just mass murder or killing?
Well, as you know, like generally, if a government like murders or tortures somebody, there's no result of the state crime of murder and torture. You know, they're sovereign. They often have sovereign immunity. Um, you might have heard the Supreme Court oral argument where they're talking about what if the president drone strikes his political opponent? Is he immune? And the majority is like, yeah. So, but sometimes this was Lemkin's original idea that genocide should be different than all that because, you know, we might not want to have a international court where anytime somebody like is in a gunfight with the police, you know, the governor goes on trial at The Hague. That would be an unwieldy and intrusive system that would undermine sovereignty. But at the same time, it would take sovereignty too far to say, yeah, you can just get rid of one of your components of your people and call it sovereignty. Sovereignty has limits, and one of the limits is preserving the living forces of humanity and the biodiversity, you could call it today, although he didn't have that word, of the species. So where you start to threaten the survival of a group, there should be a variety of consequences that ensue. And the Genocide Convention talks about a couple. It talks about prevention. So there should be a way to prevent it. And the United Nations had recently been formed with the Security Council. Now the Security Council, when they debated it, it doesn't necessarily have the right to intervene in every domestic issue and say you're doing this wrong. But they have had a record of intervening where there's a domestic pattern of atrocity that also threatens international consequences and to destabilize the peace. So that's one. It also talks about the states parties may establish an international criminal court. Well, of course, that didn't work out so well because it took them 50 years to even have an ICC treaty. In the meantime, they created these mini tribunals like Yugoslavia, and the United States and Russia did not even join the International Criminal Court as ratifying parties. Maybe they can be subject to it anyway if somebody like Afghanistan or Ukraine joins the court, you know, hasn't been adjudicated to its finality, to its final conclusion. But it's not going to be very effective anyway if there's no extradition process. And so the third thing is civil. And this is a lot of what I focus on because it's like the most realistic. And a lot of the Security Council interventions against genocide actually end up being almost worse than the cause. We could talk about that, but it's a big topic. But you could talk about the Iraq sanctions as an example of that. Not an intervention against genocide necessarily, but some people use genocide-like language in 1990 to justify that. But the third thing is civil. That's the world court. One country should be able to sue the other country for reparations in the world court, and the world court can issue reparations. And it's not a criminal thing. It's a civil thing. There could be an order to stop. There could be symbolic remedies like establish a monument to the victims, apologize, count the victims, and let them return to their homes, like the Treaty of Sèvres said. That's why I said that one book that the Treaty of Sèvres was very forward-looking, because it looks forward 100 years early to today. What some people are saying is like, if Uganda invades the Congo and Rwanda invades the Congo, and all these people are massacred and the women are abused and people lose their homes, there should be an order in the world court that they can return to their homes, the survivors, if they want to, in the Congo, and receive some kind of material reparation from Rwanda or Uganda. And that only started happening like in 2005, whereas the Treaty of Sèvres already said this in 1920. So that's what should have happened to the Armenians and the Syrians and the Greeks, is there should have been some kind of repair of at least part of the wrong. Some parts of it can't be repaired. And that's what happened after World War II. Is number one, the Allies would just start handing out like gold and houses to Jewish victims and displaced persons affected by the Nazi abuses, um, and take businesses away from the pro-Hitler industrialists and whatnot. I guess to a limited degree, but there was this thing, this denazification program, and then there was this much larger process that began of Jews submitting claims and there being like an international claims process to obtain reparations from banks and insurance companies and the state and all these other things. Plus establishing a whole country, for their benefit that Germany ended up subsidizing.
I mean, how would reparations and kind of or symbolic gestures to acknowledge the Assyrian genocide, how would that happen today? Because the Ottoman Empire obviously no longer stands, and the Assyrians don't have a sovereign state. So how could that take place in today, and how could the Assyrians get some kind of financial support or reparations, as you said, for what happened to them?
Yeah, I talk about several analogies to this. A lot of Armenians, American and Armenian from Armenia and Armenian European scholars talk about what if the state of Armenia brought this claim against the state of Turkey. That's one thing for Armenians. And there are some Assyrians who live in Armenia who could benefit from that. But it's still very difficult and probably time barred and a variety of other things. So that's not the best alternative. There are things that have lawsuits that have been filed by individual Jews and Jewish institutions, like Chabads, or individual Jews like the Altman plaintiff who had a Klimt painting from the movie The Woman in Red, I think it's called. Led to a case of Altman versus the Republic of Austria. That's another case where a Jewish person had their Coca-Cola franchise expropriated by the Nasserists in Egypt, who had an anti-Semitic motive allegedly. So that was like an illegal conversion and expropriation. Some Bosnian Muslim victims have sued Bosnian Serb alleged perpetrators in the United States and gotten orders of reparation from them. So I talk about some of these things. Theoretically, you could also bring a case like in a place like the European Court of Human Rights that Turkey has joined into, or a country like Iraq or Syria could have sued Turkey not for the Ottoman times, but for the supporting of ISIS and other rebel groups in the post-Ottoman times. That has led to a lot of the survivors of the Ottoman Christian genocide, places like Deir el-Zor, Nineveh Plains, Aleppo, led to them being displaced again, or killed. But now, of course, Syria is not going to do that, and Iraq probably won't do it either, but they theoretically could have. And it might have been some deterrent to this explosion of aggression that we've seen in the region.